Good morning. I'm John Overstrom, um, and today I'm going to be discussing how to set up a clock so that it will run as long as possible, uh, uh, routine operations of your clock, winding it and the things that you would typically do, and also lubrication of your clock and cleaning of your clock. It sounds a little daunting, but don't worry about it. These clocks are, for the most part, set up to be maintained. And when these clocks were built, they would expect that they would be taken apart every 5 years or so, lubricated and reinstalled. And it's not, so many of them are designed to have that done. So how did I get started in clock maintenance? I really have the All Saints Knitting Group to thank for that, and Cheryl Munn. As you know, the wives used to get together before COVID every Thursday afternoon and do their knitting group. And that left Cheryl and I trying to find a place to go hide while the women were meeting either at our house or at the Munn's house, or just to get together on our own. And what we came up with was Cheryl has a lot of antique clocks, and many of them weren't working. So the idea was that we would get together and fix or lubricate one of his clocks. As it turns out, it takes about 2 hours to do that. So it fits in with the knitting group's time of 2 hours. So that might take 2.5 hours, but if you get into doing it, don't worry about how long it takes. Just take your time. Any of this, there's no rush. Just take your time. And if you get frustrated for a while, just stop the work that you're doing and go do something else for a while. So the timing of all the clocks that we're talking about here is based on a pendulum. And it was actually Galileo back in the 1600s that identified that a pendulum moves at a fixed rate based on the length of the swing and the center of mass of the pendulum. Now, he did not get time to ever make a pendulum clock. He conceived of it, but he never made one. Christian Huygens, of Dutch scientist, actually made it in 1658. So pendulum clocks have been with us for a long time. And I'll show you, just here is a fishing sinker on a pipe string. And so you see that it's swinging back and forth. Now, if I take and shorten the length, you can see that it moves faster. And if I lengthen it, you can see. Now, I'm doing this in this specific fashion because this is actually, if you have a mantle clock, this is actually how it's done. On pendulum clocks or the long case clocks like this, usually there's an adjustment screw at the bottom that raises and lowers the fob on the pendulum. On mantle clocks, it's usually done via a mechanism that you'd have up here, that in the face of the clock that you stick a key in, and that shortens and lengthens the pendulum. And it's done by having a little restriction up here, and there's a mechanism that actually jacks it up. So I'm going to hold it, and you can see it's going to run much faster if I do that, and much slower when I do that. So that's that. If your clock is running too slow, you want to shorten the pendulum. If it's running too fast, you want to lengthen the pendulum. The other thing I want to show with the pendulum is that you can see that with almost no perceptible motion, I can get this pendulum moving, and you probably can't, hopefully you can't see my fingers moving, and yet I'm getting that pendulum moving, and I could make it swing even higher. And this is actually, this fork around the pendulum is actually how all of these clocks swing the pendulum. They have this little tiny fork that pushes one side or another. So the pendulum is what's actually setting the time of the clock and maintaining the clock. But in order to keep a pendulum moving, you have to, it's going to stop running if you don't put just a small amount of force in to get it going. And the mechanism that does that at the core of the clock is the core of the clock is called an escapement. The escapement serves a couple of functions. Number one, it's what drives the clock or the pendulum back and forth. And it's also what keeps the gearing of the clock in sync with the pendulum. And I had a graphic I was going to show, but I found that it froze the video when I tried to put it on. It actually locked my whole computer up. So basically, that little fork I was talking about on the pendulum attaches to what's called the anchor mechanism on the escapement. And the anchor mechanism has two tines like this that rock back and forth with the pendulum. And then the escapement has an escapement gear that the escapement is kind of an interference between the gear. So, and the spacing is such that one side of the escapement is always stopping the gears from moving any further. And as it swings down, this one's going to block the next gear. And as this one's releasing, the force is such that it's giving the pendulum a push by pushing this tooth is pushing the pendulum a little bit further. So it keeps rocking back and forth and allowing the gear to only move one step at a time because it's always in interference. The other one that's going to take over is always going to block it from moving. So that's what keeps the clockwork in sync with the pendulum. And of course, that's also the important part of a clock is the tick-tock. You know, that's what makes the tick-tock sound within your clock. So that's the escapement mechanism. Of course, in order to drive the escapement mechanism, we have a gear system. So all of these clocks, you can see on this clock, there are two different things. Most of these clocks, if you're familiar with them, you're going to have a chime half of the mechanism and a timing half of the mechanism. And in reality, they're both installed on the same clockworks, but almost to all of these clocks have only the very slightest of linkage between the two. There's basically just a little lever that tells the chime system when the minute hand is at the 6 or the 12 and when to chime. And what the chimes do is pretty much independent of the rest of the clock. Now there are some clocks that actually keep track of where the hour hand is, and that kind of controls the chime, but it's not typical. Most of them really are just independent of each other. And I'll show that a little bit later on. Now, the gear train for the clock, it's stepped up. And if you're familiar with the way a gearbox works, you can either increase torque, you can either make something turn a lot of turns and without much force, and at the other end of the gear train you have a lot of force, or the opposite way is you can have a lot of force at one end and a lot of rotations at the other. These all step up the rotations that you put into it with the spring. So on my clock, I only wind it about 8 turns a week. So 8 turns a week, and yet the escapement wheel, which I was discussing there, moves over 10,000 rotations per week. So basically any force I put in is to the clock, to the spring, is divided by more than 1,000. So the forces that are left at the very end, when you're trying to move that escapement and trying to move the pendulum, are very slight compared to the forces that you're putting on the spring when you're winding it, or the weights, if you've got a weighted clock. And so it's easy to see that if they're divided by over 1,000, that any little mote of dust, a piece of hair, a piece of lint, or a little bit of gooey oil can easily stop the clock from running. So that's that's why it is that the clocks are hard to keep running sometimes is that you get to the point where you just have to clean the clock in order to get it going again. Now, as far as the chime side of the clock, it's very similar. The gearing, it also gears it up, but not as high, not the 1,000 kind of ratio that the timekeeping portion of the clock does. But and it also has something to limit how fast it goes. Similar to the escapement, it has typically a little brass paddle wheel. And in fact, all of them. I haven't seen one that did not have this little brass paddle wheel that spins around in the air, and it reduces the speed that the chimes go at. So if that little paddle wheel wasn't there, the chimes would go bong, 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 bong. And in fact, Cheryl had a clock that was doing that, and it was because the little brass paddle wheel was not really connected to the shaft very well anymore, and the shaft was spinning freely. So all we had to do is tighten it up a little bit so that it would spin, and then it would go at the right rate. So that kind of serves the function of the escapement on the timing side to slow the clock down and stop it from free running and allowing the chime to go at a rhythmic, the chime side to go at a rhythmic rate. So let's see. So the next thing I was going to talk about was routine clock operations. Winding the clock. Most of these talk about spring winding, or as far as weights, there's not any concern. You raise the weights up, and then they fall down on their own and drive the clock. As far as the spring, what happens if you run the spring all the way down, the forces at the end of the time are very low, and then so if you start winding the clock, the forces will build up, and then it kind of hits a plateau. And you keep winding the clock, and it keeps going along, and then you get to the point where the leaves of the spring are starting to contact each other. And on my clock, I can hear that, actually hear the pieces of metal on the springs starting to get tight on each other and bind up a little bit on each other. And at that point in time, the forces are starting to build up. That's the time to stop. Don't wind any further beyond that, because these are 100-year-old plus clocks maybe, and that spring is old. There's no reason to stress it beyond that level. So don't overwind your clock. If you can do it by hearing, you can do it by feel. And as far as winding a clock, I wind mine every week on Sunday morning. And I only wind it, as I said, the 8 turns. I do like 16 half turns. Sometimes I'll notice, hey, it's a little bit weak, and I'll give it another couple of half turns. But I never try to get the spring all the way up, it's wound as tight as it could be, just because I don't want to stress it too much. Let's see. Another thing, on anytime you are moving the clock, you want to remove the pendulum, or at least confine it somehow. Because there's a lot of weight there, and it's hanging by a very delicate mechanism at the top. You don't want to damage that mechanism, so you want to restrain or eliminate the pendulum. Another thing on these clocks, so when you're setting your clock, you can move your clock forward. You don't want to move the mechanism backwards because at the points where the chime occurs, there's a little lever, and that drops. And that tells the clock, hey, it's time to run. Now, if you try to move the clock backwards past those points, it will impinge on that, and you could damage the mechanism. So, if you're nowhere near the time that it's going to chime, you can feel, you can move it back and forth a little bit, but for the most part, don't back the clock up, because if you hit those points, or if it's chiming on the quarters, there's areas where you could damage the clock. So don't move it backwards. As far as synchronizing the clock, and I don't know if you can see it, but this clock has a little cord that hangs down here, and many of them have that. Some, like my mantle clock, has a thing to do this, but it's not very obvious, unfortunately. So I can find it and pull on it, and yet, but I would say it's a little bit hard to find. So at any rate, I'm going to pull it and so, and now that I've made it chime out of sync, I'm going to move it ahead, and you'll see that now it's going to chime the half hour when it's supposed to be chiming the hour. And now it's going to chime the 10 o'clock. Would have probably been better if I did this at the 3 o'clock position, so we're not waiting so long, but
it's got a nice chime.
It's got a nice sound, yeah. So, you know, at any rate, I can use this to synchronize the hands and get it back in sync, but they're independent. As I said, see, it'll chime, is just as happy to chime the hour at the half hour point as not. And another thing is you can, almost all of these clocks, the hour hand is actually mobile. So, you know, if I come back up here and, you know, then I could actually, or get it, once I get the hour at the point where the minute hand is at the top, I could also set the hour hand where I want it. So basically you can that's how you synchronize your clock, is you've got an option to adjust it and an option that you can move the hands if you need to. Let's see what else. Did anyone have any questions up to this point? Okay, well, moving on. The next thing I want to talk about is the main problem that people have with these clocks is them not running as long as you would like. And that's actually why I have this clock. I asked Cheryl what clock would be the best one, or which one needs work. So this is one that has some features that are somewhat common to other clocks that we've worked on. So I'll try to, as I'm going through in my talk, I'll try to relate where it is that these are different and where you'll see differences between this and maybe a more common clock. So a lot of this clock, Cheryl was having problems with it running more than half an hour. He'd start it and come back and it would stop working. So I brought it to my house and I leveled it using the method that I'm going to show you now. And it ran for 14 days. Now, it probably would have run longer, but I actually stopped it and did some other things with it while I was preparing for this talk. So in reality, it probably would have run 15, 16 days. I don't know how many days. So I'm going to move the camera now so you can see closer in at what I'm trying to show you here. So you can see that this clock has a marker to tell you how to level the clock. The problem is that'll tell you how level the case is. It's not necessarily leveling the clock works. And when you move these clocks or reinstall the works, it might settle into a different location. So I kind of consider this to be an interesting feature of the cabinet, but not necessarily how the clock is leveled. So what I have done is I've taken an index card and folded it with a 90-degree bend. I'm going to put it in here. Oh, first off, I put a piece of masking tape. It doesn't matter where, but in the center is a good place, and put it in there so that can serve as a mark that I can use later on. Now I'm going to install this card. Now, I have already used this card, so you won't have to see me going through all of the pains of making it. It doesn't take that long, but so I'm trying to put this card back in where I had it before. And you can see, hopefully on the camera, you can see the marks that I'm going to eventually, would be eventually making on this card. I'm going to take, now that the pendulum's sitting here, I'm going to take and I'm going to move it to the right and left. And as I'm moving it to the right and left, I'm going to put pencil marks on here to try to get the area, max the ends of the extremes when the clock is actually, and the escape mechanism is doing its tick or its tock. So I'm going to be quiet here and move over here. So I heard one right in there. And so I'm going to put a very faint pencil mark there. And this one is right about in there, so I would put a pencil mark there. And then keep, and I'm trying to push right at the center of the fob. There's another one that over here. So I would mark here. And I keep doing that, maybe 10 times per side. I don't know if you can hear that click or not, but
Barely.
on the camera, but. So I would keep doing that until I have maybe 10 marks on each side and I get a really good idea where that clock really wants to tick or tock. And you can see I did this before. Now, actually, my new marks are not where my old marks were. And the reason is I've taken the works out of this clock and lubricated and did some other things in preparation for this thing. So this is, the works have been out, and when they were reinstalled, it's not settled in at the same place it was originally. And so now what I do is take the card back out. Now I've got marks here. I've put a mark there and a mark there and a mark across the behind on the tape so that I can get this card back in. As far as placement, try to get the card maybe within a ½ an inch of the back of the pendulum so that you don't have any parallax. So when you're looking at it, you're pretty much looking square on, and you're not going to have too many errors. So at that point in time, I'd take it back out and then make a very well-defined mark. So these are marks that I made the last time. These are the newer ones that I've put in, but I would now make a defined mark here, defined mark there, and then get out a ruler and find the center between those two. And that's what this mark is. Now when I put it back in, I put the card back in the exact same mark or same location using the marks that I had. And now I could level the clock case to be on my center mark. After I've done that, what I should be able to retest my marks, going to that side and going to that side. I should be able to retest them. And then what I can do is get the clock going. Now, this is no longer level. This isn't correct anymore because I have moved the case. But the way when I did it the first time and actually put these distinct marks in, it actually was centered properly. But now it's more to the right. So I'm going to give it a little bit more. So now I've just, and it stopped.
Let's stop.
So what if I'm trying to get it started with just enough energy to make it to have the swing be wide enough. Now what should happen if I've got it properly leveled is I could leave it now, go away, a ½ an hour I should come back, and I would find that the clock is actually swinging further than it was when I just started it, but because I was trying to start it just at the marks. And so that'll show me what margin I would actually have in the clockworks and how much energy the clockworks is putting into the pendulum versus how much is it needs. Because what it needs is it needs to swing just beyond those marks that I've put in. Any questions on that?
Hey, John, this is Cheryl. Can you reverse the camera? Because we're seeing the clock face backwards.
You know, I think you can do it on your own Zoom. I don't know if me doing it on my Zoom does, because I think it's for display purposes. So
Okay.
if I reverse it on mine, I don't think it'll reverse it on yours.
Okay, all right.
So at any rate, and so other ways you could do this, somebody like Steve, who's a drummer, what you're really also trying to do is make sure that the time between the tick and the tock and the tock and the tick are the same. So Steve might have the ability to do that with his ear and know, you know, that this clock isn't really running properly, if, you know, just by sound. But so you got to be a musician like Steve and Deb or something. But so that's it as far as leveling. And this is all I did to get this clock to run for 14 days versus a half an hour. Didn't need to oil it, didn't need to do anything else. And I've left the card in here for quite a while after that, and it's worked pretty well, you know. Now, of course, as I said, this card's no longer correct. And I'd also say that the marks now, the pretty little label they had behind here is further off now than it was when I started, to tell you the truth. So don't trust the indicator that they've put in the cabinet. So the next step I was going to talk about is, if that doesn't work, we'll talk about how to clean and lubricate the clock. So the steps of cleaning the clock, oh, got to go up. And you'll see why whether it's backwards or not won't matter in a minute, Cheryl. So the first thing you want to do is, if you're going to clean and lubricate a clock, is eliminate or take the pendulum out. And that's pretty easy. You just reach up in there, grab it, and take it out. Now, on this particular clock, the face is held on with 4 wood screws. Many of them, the face is attached to the clockworks itself. So the step I'm going to do next is not what you would necessarily do on one of those. On the German and English clocks that we've worked on, all you need to do is reach up under here, undo 2 thumb screws, and the whole work slides right out. And we have it all in our hands on the bench. This clock's a little bit different, a little more complicated in that step. So what I'm going to do next is show you how to take this clock apart. So a lot of these clocks have a taper pin in the center of the hands. Some of them have a little knurled thumb screw, and it's just threaded on, and you can unscrew it without having any difficulty. Just unscrew it and pull it out. This one has a taper. This is the fat side of the taper over here, and the slender side over here. So I'm going to take and I hope I'm not blocking the view. I'm just taking in a rather distorted way, taking a pair of needle nose pliers, and I'm pulling out that taper pin. Unfortunately, it's magnetic, so it's sticking to my needle nose pliers. Now I'm going to take off, there's some washers here, and then the hand. Now this particular minute hand can go on in 2 different orientations. It can go this way or that way. But since we can synchronize the clock anyway, it doesn't really matter how I put it back on later on. So I'm not going to worry about where the minute hand is, but it's on some clocks it would be worth trying to position it, say, to noon or something like that, so you know where to put it back on. Now this is, as I showed before, this is just held on with friction. It just slides off once you've loosened it. This clock, I have already removed the screws here and here. I'm going to remove the screws up here at the top. One. And 2. And I have the face off the clock. and all of the mechanism revealed. So at this point in time, now on this clock, there's a thumb wheel here and a thumb screw here. There's also a thumb screw here and a thumb screw here. This one actually holds on at the P. This, I accidentally hit that. So we're going to get a chime. Those thumb screws hold on the piece of wood. These thumb screws hold on the mechanism, the clockworks to the wood. So I'm going to remove these since that would be more typical of most clocks. We're just going to unscrew these. Now on the German and French clocks, all you have to do is loosen them and it'll slide out because they have slots. On this one, you have to undo the piece, the thumb screws totally. And now, this clock, I'm sorry, but this clock is so easy to trip that little lever that I find that I am tripping it all of the time while I've got it in my hands. So now we're going to swing over to the workbench area. So I said in the let's get set up here. Maybe. So in the announcement, I had a number of tools identified, and we'll talk about those now. One thing I said is a block of wood. You see this clockwork, there are, tip this up a little bit, there.
Got it.
You see there's things sticking out of the front and out of the back. I mean, here's where the pendulum hangs. Here's the chiming mechanism up here. Thank God. Yeah, there's the hammer for the chime. And so if you turn it, you can see that there's a lot of things sticking out the back. You don't want to lay the clock down on its back. Similarly, there's things sticking out the front. Now, they're not as delicate on this clock. I wouldn't have that much of a problem laying it on its front. But having a block of wood or a couple of books, sometimes you might find that the clock will want to be supported that way, and you'd need 2 blocks of wood to hold the other side. This one does fine with just 1 block of wood. So have something like that handy if you're going to work on a clock. So other tools I discussed, a 45-degree bend mechanics tweezers, or a forceps or hemostat clamp. I like to use this myself versus those. These are just small patches of cotton cloth I got from a t-shirt, and we're going to use these to clean. Other things, now you might have thought that I put on the list jeweler's screwdriver. Well, you might think I was going to actually use it for screws. Not at all. I'm using it for an oiler because I find that the blade on this screwdriver holds about the right amount of oil to oil the clock. Alternately, if you don't want to do that, here is just a paper clip that I've bent straight, and that you can use that to oil. But I find it holds a little bit less oil than I really want. So so that's why I use this. I would have to do two dips for this and only 1 dip for that to get the amount of oil I want. I didn't put this on the list, but this is an ear thing for children to put. It's from CVS or whatever, and it's good to blow out any dust that you find in the clock. I have an eye loop any magnifier will work. It's good to have that handy. Small flashlight sometimes is helpful to get in there to see what's going on. I'll show you how to use a toothpick. It's good to have a small container. Now I've got this little tin. Of course, you can use a small bowl or anything, anything to contain, you know, muffin tins, whatever. This is a measuring spoon. In reality, the amount of oil we're going to put on this clock is less than 2 or 3 drops of oil. I actually already have the oil in this. I know people don't have these, but this would work just fine. It's about the same size as one of these little things, and you just need to get a small amount of oil in there.
What kind of oil?
The oil that I am using, and there's a long story to this. I'll try to, I won't go into all of that, but when these clocks were made, the oil that was available and the best oil they had was whale oil. And whale oil was the recommended oil for clocks up until the 60s and was still used and still widely available in the beginning of the 1970s. So obviously we don't want to be using whale oil anymore. That's not exactly the what's available. So in reality, what you're looking for is an oil that is not going to vapor, doesn't have a very high vapor pressure. So something that will last a while. So you don't want to use WD-40. I used to use 3-in-1 oil. Don't use 3-in-1 oil. That also evaporates away. And a few months later, you'll find that it's already gone. So what I use is motor oil. I found a site, a couple of sites online that have one that said, hey, you absolutely have to use this synthetic clock oil. But surprise, surprise, they sell that synthetic clock oil. I found another guy that had been working on clocks for 50 years, and he did a PowerPoint presentation on oils and lubricants. His recommendation, Mobil 1 synthetic oil. So this is a synthetic oil that I'm using. I've used Castrol GTX. I started using this synthetic because our son had it in the garage and think, okay, if they think synthetics are better, I'll use the synthetics. So moving on to the tools, I also have been using this artist brush to try to eliminate any of the lint that I do find. You want to make sure that the bristles aren't going to come out of the brush and get into your clock, but they'll help you on getting the lint that you see in there out. So once you've got the clockworks in your hands, you want to look it over and see what you see, get comfortable with it. So what we're going to do to actually clean the clock is, you see I've clamped this piece of t-shirt in there, and I'm going to go around and look for the places where the oil has hardened and look at all of these. There's all these pivot points all around. There's one here, here, here. There's different wells where you'll see that that have pivot points and bearings for all of the gears. The other thing to notice is here's the gears on, let's see if I can. The gears at the spring end are very beefy. Their axles are very beefy. So they're very solid and have a lot of forces on them. By the time you get to the gears up here, where the escapement is, they're fairly delicate. So you need to be, careful with those. And you should be careful with all of them, but you really need to be more careful with those. So what I'm going to do, or what I would do, is I just go around and I'm going to wipe off any excess old oil that I see there. And I'd go around the whole clock doing this, looking carefully for anything I see, trying to get any old crud off and loosen it up. I do that on the outside, I do that on the back side, I do that on the front side. and get it to the point where I don't see any of that. I'd look inside between the works, and here's where having the hemostat or the small tweezers to get in there helps a lot, as you can get inside and make sure that any accumulated oil or old, you'll see it black usually, where it's worn or been in use for a long time. And you want to get all that old, black, dirty oil out, anything that's turned brown out of there. And just keep going around. Now, I said you don't want to use WD-40 or 3-in-1. But if the grease or the oils have hardened, you might want to use them on your cloth as a solvent to soften up the stuff that's there. Otherwise, otherwise don't use that as the actual lubricant. Now, once I've done that and have the clock all cleaned and I look it over, and again, as I said before, if you get tired of doing the small motor activity, give yourself a break and get back to it later. Then, as far as re-lubricating the clock, I have a very small amount of oil in the bottom of this, and this is only going down in there about 1/8 of an inch. And then I'm just going to take and go to each one of those spots, and then they have a little well to take the oil. I'm going to put that in there, and the oil has sucked right into that location. I go to the next one. And as I said, you can do this with a paper clip also. It's not as precise as the screwdriver. I like the screwdriver better. But you just go around to all of the locations, and you might find the paper clip, maybe you need to do two dips instead of one. It depends on how much oil you've actually picked up when you do it. One thing I forgot to show you is another cleaning method, which is not something I've done very much, is once you've got it all cleaned out, wiped up with the rag, is the round paper clip. And this is really what professionals do more, is they have a wooden probe like around toothpick, and you just go around and try to rotate it around and get more dirt out of the center out of those bearings. Now you do that before you lubricate. I forgot to show you that. So that's what the toothpick is for. If you get done lubricating it, you might want to dab up any excess. If you get any excess around, you want to dab that up. As I said, you might want to look at the clock fairly carefully with maybe a magnifier glass. See if you see anything that's dirty in there. Brush it off with the brush or with the artist brush, and that's about it. At that point in time, we just put it back together. I should say now, this is, since the face was already removed, on the German and English clocks, the face would still be on here. So you'd have to do what I did on the clock. You'd have to do that before you can get to the face side of the clock. Those are also usually have taper pins holding the clock on. So you take the hands off, and then you usually have taper pins that hold the face on also. If you don't feel up for that, you can actually lubricate it. It's not as good, but you can actually leave the face on while you're working and try to lubricate from the back, from the inside of the clockworks, and that'll work. You're able to get the oil into the bearing surfaces and lubricate it adequately. It's not as good as having the whole face clean, but it'll work. So that's it as far as clock cleaning and lubrication. I'm not going to show you putting it back together. And see what I've missed here. So a couple of things I should show you is here is the hammer for the chime. All of them are going to have usually have a brass hammer with a small leather or rubber, usually a leather piece in the hammer. So if you have your chime is very metallic sounding, it may be that the leather is either missing or has gotten very hard. If these, you can see that there's a bend and there's just this nice curvature to this hammer rod. So that's totally determined at the time of installation in the case that the clockmaker put that curve in. If they've bent it too far back, your chime won't hit very hard. If they bent it too far forward, it might hit and actually dampen out the chime when it strikes the chime. So that's, that adjustment can change the way your chime sounds. So there are, so there are chime issues that you can work on there if you're having issues with that. So my overall takeaways then are that level the clock, remove the pendulum when you're moving your clock. Most of these clocks are built to be, leave it there for now. Most of these clocks are built to be maintained. They're relatively easy to work on. The lubricants today are much better than whale oil. I mean, people have been working on, ExxonMobil, Chevron, Shell, they've been perfecting oils for many years, and they're much more superior to what they were back in the day when they were using whale oil. So your modern day lubricants, say motor oil, are much better than what they had. Don't move the clock hands backwards, and don't overwind a clock spring. So another thing I was going to do is jump quickly to a different style of clock, just to discuss it. So this is my, it's a Seth Thomas Made in America mantle clock. This clock has a, so this clock, in order to work on this clock and do the same thing that I did as far as cleaning, this clock has a very nice feature in that there is a little clip in here. You can see the pendulum swinging. There's a little clip in here to stop the pendulum from swinging so that you can transport it around the house fairly easily and not have to worry about damaging anything by moving it with the pendulum still in. But once I've pinned it there, it's fairly easy to remove the fob, remove the pendulum fob. And now you can see that the clockworks are somewhat blocked by this chime mechanism. That's the hammer on this clock. And there's the chime. It's a wound up piece of steel. So you can't take the clockworks out of this without removing this chime. And that's pretty easy because you just undo a nut at the bottom. So you undo that nut, you pull out the chime, and then on the forward side, it's the same as what I showed you before on the other clock. You have a taper pin. Pull the taper pin, take the two hands off, and so then it's ready to come out. The face stays on the clock case in this case. And then there are 4 screws on the clock, wood screws. You do that to remove the mechanism, and from there on, it's the same as what I was discussing on the other one. So they're really about the same. This has that mechanism I talked about that controls the length of the pendulum, because we obviously can't get down in behind here to shorten the pendulum. The pendulum's actually, length is controlled up here at the top. So that's all I have to discuss today. Okay, now you can move the camera up and
Oh, I was gonna put it behind
So,
here.
so I do have a question, John. This is Cheryl. I saw that you just put a very small amount of oil in each of those, and especially with this new synthetic, how long does that last? How often do you have to go back in and redo that?
Well, the original, they used to assume 5 years. So that's with old lubricants. I've got to believe that a lubricant that's designed for high temperature use in a car, I mean, it's not going to degrade at room temperature basically forever. I mean, I don't know that you would need to do it more than, once every 10 years. That, our houses are cleaner than they used to be too. I mean, you got to figure there were a lot of people that smoked a lot. There was coal fired furnaces, there were coal fired and wood fired stoves, and there was a lot of dirt in the air in an old house. And nowadays, our houses are cleaner. I think you can go a long time. Now, that Seth Thomas clock that I showed you, I've actually had that running in my house for 33 years, I think.
Hmm.
And I had never cleaned it until a week and a half ago in preparation for this. I just thought I'd see how to do it, so I did it. But yeah, it's run without any problem for all that time.
Since you're using motor oil, is there any particular SAE that is better than another?
Well, the I don't know that it matters too much. The you would I was thinking about whether a lighter oil would be better. But I can tell you the PowerPoint that this guy did, the PowerPoint that this guy did had recommended different oils at each different stage of the mechanism. So, like at the clock, the gear, or the spring end, he had one oil weight, and at the escapement end, he had another weight. So I don't think it's going to make that much difference.
Hmm.
So on your clocks, I was using Castrol GTX 10W30, and this clock, though, now I'm using this one's 5W20. I, I think it's not going to make that much difference. Have to wait and see, 10 years or whatever.
We'll check back with you then.
Any other questions?
John, if you know you're going to clean the clock when you're starting, would you do best to do the clock cleaning and then do the leveling after you've cleaned and reassembled?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that clock leveling is something you would do when you're setting it up after you've cleaned it, or when you're just, installing the clock the first time or whatever. The other thing that I've noticed is these clocks, they'll shift pretty easily. Now, the one that I had I was using is the sample here actually has pins that you can kind of drive into the wall so that it doesn't swing. But if you don't drive those pins into the drywall of the wall, it'll easily tilt a little bit while you have the door open, and make the clock case swing, and then it'll throw it all off. So I would recommend, if you don't have some way that it pins itself, and it is a clock that's going to be off balance, put some little pencil marks or something on the wall so that you know how to get the case back to where it belongs.
John, this is Madeline. I have a question. I have a mantle clock from
Uh-huh.
1930 something, but when you set the pendulum, you have to look at the back of the clock and then you turn it around. So are you messing it up when you turn it around?
So honestly, my experience, at least on my clock, is that it just runs. I mean, it's a mantle clock, and I haven't had to worry about it as much. I think it's the long case clocks where you have a pendulum that's hanging a long ways down and it actually doesn't have that much motion. Whereas my mantle clock, I mean, the pendulum swings only like that, and that thing's going, has quite a large swing, and I don't think it matters that much with the mantle clock. So,
Okay.
so that was primarily for a long case clock. Any other questions?
Are they normally like an 8-day wind up?
I think so. My mantle clock is, I'm sure that this clock I had as an example here is probably a 2-week clock or so, maybe, you know, probably 16-day or something like that. But honestly, I would recommend only winding them once a week. Number one, if, you know, it's hard to remember, hey, it's the odd week, I'm gonna go wind my clock, you know, so it's easier just to have every week wind it at the same time, and don't wind it so much so that it's easier on the clock.
Okay, thanks.
But some people, some of the clocks, I know we've had, we bought my parents a cuckoo clock that you had to wind every day.
Yeah, John, this one that you're aware of, I have in the hallway here that I told you the other day. You know, it's supposed to be an 8-day clock, and it was running 8 days for a while now, but now it only runs about 4 days. Would you suspect that's balance?
It might be. That's one thing I had the opportunity with. I've had Cheryl's clock for a few weeks now, and I had the opportunity with, you know, once I'd set up that card to see how the pendulum was swinging, and that it was swinging beyond the marks and the right amount. You need to be a fixed amount beyond those marks. And I could see that it's getting less and less and less and less. And as soon as it doesn't go past the point where the escapement is going to swing, going to tick on that side, it stopped. I mean, because there's no way. So it can, you know, the swing will just keep gradually going less and less and less as the clock runs down. Okay, well, I guess that's it then.
Thanks very much, John.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
This is
As
Fran.
always.
Thanks, John.
Have a good day, everybody.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.